Hello, dear listeners. Today's conversation is about Yasushi Inoue's novel Tun-Huang, published in 1965 and translated into English by Jean Odemoy in 1978. This is another New York Review of Books Classics, our second after Notes of a Crocodile, and it tells the tale of bookish Chao Xingtai leaving his cloistered world of government official examinations for the Western Chinese frontier. We touch on a number of our favorite topics, such as the importance of curation, the charms of the bookish protagonist, and the features of a historical novel, of which you'll hear me argue Tun-Huang is a unique example. Damien Searles, writing the introduction for the NYRB edition, notes that I would say, aware that my own reflections will no doubt seem time-bound and off-key in a few decades, not to mention the centuries that are Inoue's usual timescale, that Inoue's great theme, spanning his historical, contemporary, and autobiographical works, is how the life you lead is not your real life. What we think of as our personal struggles, our decisions, desires, deliberations, the choices we make and the things we do are less real, less to be trusted, and perhaps ultimately less important than the wider forces of historical destiny or their cultural past, or the way we started to feel as a child, or simply the fact that other people are not who we think they are, and nor are we. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome back, listeners, to the Infinite Library podcast. This is just a Infinite Library Classic episode. Just me and John in here, no guests, and we're doing the straight dope. We're doing a NYRB Classic.
Oh man, it's so quiet in here today in the library. There's no one else here. We're all alone.
We're all alone. You can faintly hear rustling through the long stacks. We don't know what it is. But we're just going to try to ignore it because as far as we know, we're just alone in here.
We're finally getting to the point in the podcast where we're going to start building up the lore. Isn't that exciting?
I'm sure listeners have been waiting with bated breath to find out what is this library and how did our beloved podcast hosts get there. Who can say? Man.
All right, yeah, listeners. So this week we are talking about a really cool little book called Tun-Huang, or if I'm going to be pedantic about it, it should be pronounced Tun-Huang, by Yasushi Inoue. Like Ben said, an NYRB Classic edition of a Japanese novel about medieval China.
And an interesting example of historical fiction where if you read the author's introduction, he just was really interested in medieval China, and he wondered how something happened, and he decided to write a book to explain it.
Yeah, so, Ben, before we kind of get into the book itself, I figured this is maybe like a good moment for us to talk a little bit about, like, New York Review of Books and their kind of collection, like this classics collection that they've been putting out for quite some time, which I feel has become like something of a meme in like the literary like online space, but also like I don't know, I know we're both like fans insofar as you could really say you're like a fan of a book imprint, but I don't know, I think they're like they put out good books, but I feel like there's something to kind of the way they do things that I think says something interesting about kind of like, there's not a great way for me to put this, but like, there's something like where reading is like a hobby.
Yeah. Given that it's kind of like extremely niche, it's interested in like digging up like neglected stuff and presenting it in like a very aesthetically pleasing package.
Yeah.
So I feel like, that seems to be right on the money, John. I also
got people that I know addicted to nerds. So it's also somewhat of a drug. And let me just describe to you. So, I'm at work. People who I work with read sometimes on the job when there's downtime. And somebody that I've been talking to who I would consider a friend, she's always like, yeah, I go to Half Price and I try to find like weird MFA novels. And I was like, hey, you should read something good. And then I gave her a copy of Notes for the Crocodile, which we covered, for free, gratis. And then the next time I saw her, I said, there's an NYRB sale. And we went halvesies on the NYRB sale. And I realized this is what a dealer does. A dealer gives you a taste of the drug free and said, the next one's going to cost you something. So, and for lack of a better word, though, as you said, John, I think the niche appeal plus the aesthetic package, I think, is a nice combo. And it also covers things that I think are worthy of reading, but that don't make, common canonization or major lists. And you have to kind of dig for some of the stuff.
Yeah, it's like, I don't want to flatter ourselves too much in saying this, but I feel like they're almost kind of doing something similar to like what we've said we're trying to do with the podcast, which is kind of dig under that like initial layer of sentiment, the big novels, and kind of get to like that next layer beneath of stuff that is just as good, if not better, than a lot of kind of the big name writers and books maybe you just hear about in like your freshman English class, and really getting that out in front of people, which I think is a super worthy goal, but then also kind of putting them out in a way where it's like, oh, the books look nice. They feel good to hold. They have a very nice like heft to them for like commercial paperbacks. Like the covers feel very like sturdy. The pages don't feel like they're like printed on phone book paper. They always pick like very nice, classy cover arts. But I feel like there's this kind of interesting space that NYRB is filling. And I think the Criterion Collection does something similar for movies.
Definitely,
I think there's kind of this space for, like, it's not age coded, but I feel like there is a group of people in the world, and I think it overrepresents people who are passionate about like art and culture in a serious way, but like there are people who like don't want to be treated like babies.
Yes,
And the fact with the NYRB stuff is it's not cute. Like the Criterion channel, it's not cute. Even if there's stuff that's funny or silly, or NYRB like has children's books in its collection. I know they have at least like one like Tove Jansson like Moomin's book in their collection. But unlike so many other like cultural spaces that we find ourselves in 2024, you don't feel like you're occupying like a space that is trying to like either infantilize you or like you are literally like rubbing shoulders with children. Like, I don't know. I feel like every other streaming service kind of like except Criterion. And I know there are other ones that I probably like don't know about that kind of fill in more kind of niche subject matter, but like every streaming service now has like a cute logo and these like silly sounds that play when you like open them. And
not a fan of those. I don't want to be reminded of like operating system logic while I'm attempting to watch something.
And that's before we just get to the fact that they're all now just hawking their own like original content now. There's no real sense that you're being shown things that are actually good. You're just being shown whatever the latest slop that this company has decided to put in front of you is. And like, I don't want to overly praise NYRB and Criterion because at the end, like they are also still like capitalist projects. Like they are doing it. They're doing this because it's a market niche. But I do think there is something that's like really refreshing about just feeling like, maybe this is capitalism, but at least it's capitalism that's treating me like I am like a functioning like adult with a brain who can like think like more deeply than like a 10-second TikTok clip.
And crucially, like with NYRB, a lot of it is in translation. So it's like you don't really have access to it otherwise. So it's not like I'm going to NYRB to get like a fancy new edition of The Sun Also Rises or something like that. It's like, I'm going to NYRB to get this novel that was translated in Japanese, the one that we're talking about today. For instance, they've recently been publishing a ton of Vladimir Sorokin's stuff. who's a very controversial Russian author. And you know, I could talk about that a lot. We don't have to go there, but they're trying to get people's eyes in front of stuff that is like neglected, and also is like they're treating the people, their audience, as like intelligent consumers. Which, like, you know, it sounds like a weird thing to say, but as you said, it is nice to be treated like an adult. And I know for me, I like initially, if you ever go to Half Price, which John and I are big Half Price books hounds, NYRBs just would immediately pop on the shelf. You would see like an all color book and you'd say, what is that? And then you'd pull it down and you'd say, oh, this is interesting. Like, I remember one of the first NYRBs I got was a complete translation of all of the Macrol novels, which are I believe an Argentinian author's, like, he basically created a character who's just always traveling because he's a sailor, and he has like this weird mercurial relationship to life, and he gets to see all these exotic locales, and he gets to like meet a lot of hot women. But it's got this sort of like melancholy air, and I was like, I had never heard of this. I would not have heard of it in any other way. And coming across it on the stack, it was just like this, you know, bright orange book that just stood out. And I was like, I'd like to look at that, you know? So again, like, I think they know what they're doing. And I think that the niche appeal is important, because I feel like, yeah, now that there's so much more opportunities for slop, I think it's very important to kind of protect your, your niche interest and be able to explain why you think it's important. Because, like, and I'll keep this soapbox to a minimum, a lot of the things they like to talk about in the humanities is that we're not good at advocating for why we're better or alternative to STEM. And in fact, we're letting STEM just steamroll all over us. So I think, like, talking about like why the humanities are important without using the empathy argument, because I think that's overused. I think we've talked about that. I think pointing to something like NYRB and talking about why it's useful, I think can be, you know, related.
Absolutely.
So.
And I think that this actually is going to segue kind of interestingly with the book, as we kind of talk about preservation, I guess. Maybe not preservation, but definitely like curation and like attempting to kind of find what's important in chaos, which trying to be a savvy media consumer in 2024 often feels like a challenge, I guess.
Well, also too, though, like, I want to jump a little bit ahead and say, like, Inoue wrote this book because he was interested in this time period, and one of the protagonists is interested in writing from a different language that he's not familiar with. And so the book takes like I wouldn't say maybe fanish, but like an amateurish interest in things very seriously, and that leads him to kind of preserve these Buddhist cultural artifacts, jumping into the plot, that, you know, are under threat of destruction. So I think, like, celebrating your amateurish interest in stuff, I think, is really important. And, you know, don't let somebody tell you that it's like a dumb hobby or something, or that, like, you know, you should be infantilized for having hobbies or something like these things are important. I think. So
let's leave NYRB kind of as an institution behind for a little bit, and let's actually dive into the book. Like Ben said, the story is broadly about kind of explaining how a cache of Buddhist sutras and other kind of important religious documents found their way into a hidden cave in the Chinese province of Tun-Huang or Dun-Huang in the early 1300s. Like Ben said, this was written by Yasushi Inoue, who we'll get to his biography, I think, here in just a sec, but basically he served in the Imperial Japanese Army in China. Apparently he did not do anything particularly bad. He actually like got athlete's foot and got sent home pretty quickly. But
yeah, I saw that. That athlete's foot must have been real bad. I was imagining how bad it was. When I first read that
in like the little author biography, I was like, athlete's foot? And then I was like, oh God. I like thought through the actual implications of having athlete's foot so bad you have to get sent home from the Imperial Japanese Army. And I was like, oh. Just horrified.
Just like the doctor's looking at your foot and he's just like, yeah, this is all fucked up. We're gonna have to go home.
But he developed a very strong interest in Chinese history and culture, which led him to write this book. So, had you ever heard of Mr. Inoue? before we got started here, Ben?
No, but I had a couple people tell me that they had heard of him. I had not personally. I was interested to discover that a lot of his stuff had gotten adapted into movies, which I also had no idea about. So
yeah, this was the first book of his that I had heard of, and it's kind of surprising because apparently he is, a really like important author to modern Japanese literature, and a lot of the books that kind of got described in that introduction, which is by Damien Searles in the edition we both read. They sounded really interesting. It sounds like it's a lot more historical fiction, a lot of fiction kind of about art and preservation, which are topics that I know you and I obviously are both interested in. So he's definitely somebody I definitely feel like I want to check out more. I was a little disappointed in that intro. It was said that at least a good number of his novels have still not been translated to English. They've been translated into French, but not our glorious tongue. So,
also, did you notice that like this was originally published in 1956 in serialized form, and then like I don't know how long it took the translator to translate it, but like it eventually came out in like the 70s. So there was like again like kind of a huge gap between like when he was writing at least some of this stuff and when it actually got like picked up by like the global, we could say like globalized
it's something
literary sphere or something like that.
I find it really interesting. Obviously any culture, with a written language produces literature. And I'm so fascinated by the way that, different things get get picked up for translation and other things don't. And, I think I've mentioned on the pod before, I really love Chinese literature in general. It's the reason I'm learning Chinese, but specifically I'm a big fan of like wuxia martial arts novels, and it's amazing that there are so many novels that are so influential in that genre in China and influenced movies that have been translated over here but have never been translated into English outside of a very dedicated like fan translation community. Legend of the Condor Heroes, which is a book I know I've told you about, probably the most successful, like, popular Chinese novel of, like, the post-war years. Only just got translated into English, like, 4 years ago. And it was written in, like, the 60s.
Wow. Was that the one that was the basis for that movie that got made?
Yes.
For like
Eagle Shooting Heroes, which
called?
Is a very funny Golden Harvest, like, kung fu parody movie. You don't need to read the book to understand it, but that's also a great movie on the Criterion channel. But kind of to bring us back around, it's fascinating how these decisions get made. They're all on this kind of diffuse level where the market is kind of making the decision in some ways, and the literary establishment makes decisions in some ways. Like, obviously, Inoue is kind of writing at a time where he's kind of, he is a contemporary, I guess we'd say, of Mishima. But obviously, Mishima gets picked up a lot faster by kind of the international literary establishment, and we're getting translations of him a lot sooner than we seem to have gotten translations of Inoue. And I think, actually, that's kind of despite the fact that I think they're kind of I think there are parallels. Like I found myself thinking a little bit of like Pavilion of the Golden Temple as I was reading this, or Temple of the Golden Pavilion.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think
the second
I think it's
one
because they're both books kind of about art and Buddhism in particular. I think they come away with very different conclusions at the end of them, but I think it's really interesting. Just the way that these decisions get made, how so much literature just is never going to get translated into English or another. Like, some of it's great to speak English because a lot of stuff does get translated in English. Like, I can't imagine what it's like being someone in a country where like you don't learn English, but also no one's gonna like pay to have a novel like this translated into whatever language you do speak.
Yeah, and I also think too, like, Mishima has kind of like an attraction for his like really intense psychology. And I think with Art, the author today, there's a lot less of that. It's a lot more about like the time period that you live in and the actions that people do in that time period, and like sort of portraying like the arc of history too, which I think is like really interesting. And like, again, like in the intro, he's just like, yeah, I was just kind of interested in this cave, and I was like, how did that stuff get there? And then like, and he's just like, like, what if I wrote a story that explained it? Like, he's very like matter of fact, and he's very humble too. Like he says, like, when I think back to when I was reading for the material for this book, I was having a pretty good time. So like, which I found to be like really charming, I think, like in terms of like, just like, here's this guy and he's interested in this stuff and he wants to tell it to you in like a very matter of fact way, rather than kind of like, something like with Mishima where you get the like, the repelling into the self-conscious, mind, and like the sort of tortured things that you can't say in polite society, like stuff like that. Like he's just kind of telling you the facts.
That's an interesting parallel there. Well, I guess we should probably like actually start describing the book a little bit.
Yeah, because I did jump ahead real quick. So crucially, and this is where John already talked about this, but the important part I think for Tun-Huang or Tun-Huang is that he's basically, it's in a time period where the main character is taking the imperial examination, I believe, and he basically falls asleep and he misses his appointment, and then he basically like encounters some stuff that makes him realize that like, why was he so interested in studying for this like imperial examination? Like his sort of experience is so small in comparison to what he sees. And I find that initial thing to be important too, because like in talking about like these religious, scrolls and artifacts that get preserved in this temple and like walled off away so that people don't even know they're there, there's like an emphasis like that this stuff is more important than like whatever these characters' lives could end up to. And I think that's like something I'm sure we'll talk about, but I wanted to sort of note that like immediately your attention is cued in that like in reading the introduction that he's telling you why he's interested, like the scrolls are the important part, and like the characters are gonna like get us there.
With our main character, Chao Xingta. He's a young man living in the Song Dynasty, as the book puts it, and he seems to come from like a fairly well-off background. He is a young scholar. He's spent his whole life preparing for these exams. He comes to the imperial capital to take the exam and, hopefully earn a position in the imperial bureaucracy, only to fall asleep in the entrance hall. And basically he's like, can I still take the exam? And they just kind of shrug. And so he kind of has had his whole life turned upside down by this fact. And for those who don't know, the Chinese civil service exams were insanely difficult. You spent your entire life like basically memorizing these classical texts of Confucian literature, and they had like a 1% pass rate to like actually get a job, like get a good job, like in the imperial bureaucracy by the end of it. So you spent your whole life kind of preparing for them for this very, very slim chance of landing a very cushy position if you could pass. So yeah, he fails, and he just kind of ends up wandering throughout the city, which I really appreciated this part of the book, because I think that I don't know what you've been, but I definitely remember times in my life kind of feeling this way. Like we're both overeducated millennials. But I definitely remember like points in my life where I was like, I graduated from university basically, and I'm somebody, I spent a lot of like time and effort like trying to get into a very prestigious school, and then I got there and I was like, I don't know why I'm here, what I'm doing. And then I graduated and I was like, I still don't know why I did that or what I'm doing now. And obviously I didn't fail out of this exam I spent my whole life preparing for, but I kind of felt that way. And I find it really interesting. So I think that the experience he has is very relatable to me, because basically he ends up wandering aimlessly and he comes across some foreign people, and he's like, oh, these guys seem cool. I want to learn about them now that I've fucked up my life in my home country.
Well, and too, it's like an incredible sort of juxtaposition, because like he's coming across a completely naked woman who's and there's a man with a saber. And the man with the saber is like, I'm selling this woman by the part. like how much for her leg? How much for her arm? And he notes that the woman is completely okay with this. She's just kind of lying there, and she's resigned to her fate. And like suddenly, like the main character realizes, like, why was I taking this exam so seriously? like there's like this sort of like incredible like shift in perspective, and he decides to pay for the woman's release. And so they like haggle or something, and he like pays enough money, and then she gives him her identification, which is written in like Shia script that he has like never seen before, and he's like fascinated by this like writing that he didn't even know existed, and like that kind of gives him a new purpose, a new reason for being. But I thought a lot about the fact that like, and you know, the author doesn't say like in a shift of perspective he was realizing that his life was, he's just like so sort of blown away by what he sees, and like I had to kind of fill it in because like Inoue will give you only just the bare necessities, and I really liked that kind of shift in perspective. So yeah, like he sees the people and they're like, wow, these people are cool, and they're like a lot more like, you know, like I don't know, hardened than I am, who's just like this like scholar. Yeah, so. So question,
yeah,
the pronunciation of, is it the Xia?
Okay, so that's something I actually had like a small tangent prepared on.
Okay.
So this book, all the like names are done in Wade Giles, which is an older version. So like basically like any kind of any language that is not written in English, or more specifically, like not written alphabetically, like you're going to have like different ways of like transliterating that from that language to something readable in English.
Yeah.
But Wade Giles is like an older version. So like Wade Giles is like anything written like kind of like any Victorian, so like post World War II, like Chinese translations are going to be in Wade Giles, and even a little bit after that, the modern system is called Pinyin, and it was actually developed by the Chinese government, and so that's like what I've learned to use. So I find reading Wade Giles to be like, on the one hand, like kind of charmingly archaic. On the other hand, like kind of like frustrating.
Yeah. Did you get the NYRB edition? Because because the intro made a note of that. Something about it being dated, I think, is what the intro said.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of lit I've read, like the novel The Nine Cloud Dream I told you about a couple months ago. That was also written in Wade Giles.
Oh, interesting.
I think some publishers do it now, like kind of to create a like archaic like translation, which I have mixed feelings on, because again, if you're like, I don't know, I know I'm like in a minority here because like I'm someone who's like actually trying to like learn Chinese, but it's like it's frustrating because it's like, okay, I already can't actually tell what this word is supposed to be because there's no tone markers, and none of these books will just like have the decency just have like a glossary with like the characters in it. So it's like I can't actually tell what the characters would be if I was reading this in Chinese, and now you're throwing like another layer of like confusing bullshit on top of it with this system that like actual Chinese speakers think sounds silly and doesn't work. Like, you know how Taoism is sometimes translated as Taoism?
Yeah.
That's a Wade Giles. So technically, like, the actual place in China is Tun-Huang, not Tun-Huang.
I did start to notice that, and I was like, oh, I guess I can see the difference. The difference between Tun-Huang and Tun-Huang.
Yeah. So it's not, like, once you kind of know what everything is, it's not terribly hard, because basically it's just, like, one transliterate, like, basically, like, the HS, so the Xia in this book is more properly Xia. So XIA or XIXIA.
Yeah, so would that be Xing Te, the main guy?
yeah, so he'd be Chao Xingte,
How she
the Xixia woman, Li Yuan Hao, Tun-Huang Li, Wei Chi would basically be pronounced the same, but it'd be spelled, I think, Chi. That's weird because it has the apostrophe, and those are always kind of throwing me off. And so it'd probably be just UI, so it'd be Wei Chi.
Wei Chi. Okay.
And then Yuan He. Wait, so a lot of it is the same.
Okay.
It's kind of these weird ones. Like the DT one is probably the biggest one in terms of just like you're straight up just saying that wrong.
Okay.
Whereas like the HS or like the TS, if you've seen that, it's like Cao Cao from Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Yeah. In Pinyin, it's spelled CAO because for whatever reason they decide. Like I don't even know exactly why they did this. I have a book on like how Pinyin was developed that I really need to like read. But it's pronounced with kind of that TS sound, so it's Cao Cao, not Cow Cow.
Yeah.
So there's no perfect way to do it.
Yeah, there's a little wiggle room, I guess. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, I kind of wonder if Wade Giles. I don't know for sure because I've never done the research that like I probably should. But I wonder if it was developed just in conversation with like a different dialect of Chinese, and maybe that's why it's off.
I mean that would make sense to me, and also like there are some, it's actually kind of fitting. I feel like for the plot of this book, also just like sort of like differences in dialect that are nonetheless very important.
Yeah, there's. So crucially, these people he comes across, they're from the West, so they are not ethnic like Han Chinese. I believe the woman is like you said, Ben. She's from the Xixia Kingdom, which is this it's a real historical place, no longer exists. But they were a Tangut speaking polity that is very crucial to the plot of this book, and the man is a Uyghur. Who is a group that still exists. This takes place before their conversion to Islam. But basically these are Western, like semi-Turkic, or again, Tangut peoples. So, they're very strange to our protagonists. They have this vitality. They speak Chinese. Their countries exist kind of in the Chinese like sphere of influence. But I feel like what really came across to me in that scene, and it's probably one of my favorite scenes in the book, is just kind of this realization he has that he's kind of lived his whole life in like a bubble, and that there's this whole world outside of this system that he exists in, and that outside of that bubble of the Chinese Empire, there are people who look different and talk different and write differently and live in different ways. And I think that is a really like fundamental human experience that I don't know that we talk about a lot.
Yeah.
But I feel like we almost all kind of have a similar experience at one point in our lives. Like, I think now it's very much like mediated through media. Like, I remember kind of being a kid and seeing anime on TV, like seeing Pokemon, and noticing for the first time, like, oh, this is like drawn differently than like other like cartoons I've watched.
Yeah.
And the way that they're talking is different. Obviously I was watching like dubs at the time because I was like 6, but like you could just tell that like there's something different about the way that they're talking, and then you find out, oh, this is from a different country, and it kind of opens the whole world up for you.
Yeah.
And I just really like the scene. I think it really did a wonderful job like illustrating this experience that I think we all have, but we don't all talk about.
And I think it's consistent with his character in that like he's given this script, some writing, and he's like, man, I need to find out more about this. Basically, it's sort of like this. He's like, I can continue kind of being a scholar, but in a way where I'm more driven to explore this world and like the western frontier of China, which sounds honestly crazy. like we can talk about that later, but the sort of scale of the western frontier is like quite unparalleled. I almost feel like, because I mean, I don't know enough about like, you know, Eastern history to say like, but like at one point he's like traveling and he travels really far to get somewhere, and he's reminded of somebody else who wrote like, if only I could die like 200 miles from where he is, because like that guy's even further out than he ever was. Like, and I like read that and I was like, holy shit! Like
yeah, it's definitely got like kind of like a Wild West vibe.
Yeah.
Like you just kind of feel like, oh, there are these like little pockets of civilization, like just surrounded by horrifying stretches of desert.
And like, you know, as he says in the intro, he was fascinated by the description of that landscape where it was like there's no living thing around for thousands of miles. I mean, something like that. Yeah. So,
but so yeah, he basically like goes to some government agency and is like, hey, so these Xixia people, who at this point are like a rising power in the West. They're not like established, but they're clearly like becoming like a known presence. He's like, I think they're going to be big. And so he convinces the Chinese government to like give him a commission to go out west and learn these people's language.
Yeah.
And he does so, and immediately ends up getting everything goes tits up. He gets like where the city he was supposed to like kind of get started at, and the city is rapidly conquered by the Xixia, and he finds himself conscripted into their army with some other Chinese folks.
What did you think about the sequence where he keeps asking what's going on and they keep hitting him? Like when he gets conscripted, like there's a sequence where he keeps like asking, he's like, where am I? Like, what's happening? And they just keep hitting him in the head. And then eventually he's like, well, I guess I'm in the army now. like
you know, I found it kind of funny on the one hand.
Yeah.
There's something kind of slapsticky about it. I think it serves as kind of it's a hardening. You know, like you said, the thing he kind of seems to feel that he lacks when he sees the Westerners in the market in the capital, you know, he feels like he lacks some salt. Yeah. And I think that like there's this is kind of like where he loses some of that softness. And like you said, we don't get like a lot of his psychology, but after this happens like probably the second or third chapter. After this chapter, he's a much more hardened person. He's a lot more able to kind of take the twists and turns that the plot throws at him. Because he goes on to live like a pretty like intense, adventurous life from this point.
Yeah.
And so I feel like this is kind of like the baptism by fire. Like he's just getting thrown into it, and it kind of shows us, I think, as readers, like, okay, this guy, maybe he was like a scholar before, but like he's kind of got his legs under him. He can handle this. Like, this is not going to be a book about like somebody like just getting, just breaking down and like not being able to hack it.
Yeah, and too, like in the initial sort of battle sequences, he's very much kind of resigned to whatever happens. Like he just kind of rides into battle. And there, like a few times he faints, and somehow he's like not killed because he's still tied to his horse, basically. So like, there's this kind of like he just kind of like gives up kind of any expectation, and he's just like, I might not live or die, you know, like, and then he ends up like living.
Well, it's interesting because like we've kind of said, the prose in this book is very sparse, and Inoue does not either did not want to or did not feel like he could like write a full battle scene, because basically Qingta's job is basically to ride into battle on a horse, like pulling a whirlwind cannon, which is a device I don't actually know what, like that word is supposed to describe, and I haven't been able to find a translation. But the cannon, apparently, if he like gets it into the middle of the battle, like it'll kind of just do, either somebody else handles it or it just kind of does its thing. And then he could just
I got the impression it was some sort of like area of effect cannon. Like it was like spinning around and like hitting a bunch of random people. Like he needed to get it
like
in
if
the
he
middle.
can if he can get the cannon in the middle of the battlefield, like if he faints and just gets carried back like on his horse that he's tied to, like it's fine. He doesn't actually need to like be conscious the whole time, which again I found kind of funny. I don't know if it was supposed to be comedic, but I feel like it was supposed to be.
Well, yeah, because like he's just like passing out and surviving, and then at some point, like he's that guy who's in command, Wang Li, is like, "Hey, you're pretty good at fighting," and he's just like, "I guess," like, or something. Like it's very like he's like, "Yeah, like he doesn't say like, oh, I'm a proud fighter." He's just like accepting like what happened, more or less. So
kind of by serving in the Xixia army, he ends up getting he ends up being able to arrange that he's able to go to the Xixia capital, and he spends a couple years putting together basically a Xixia Chinese dictionary. And it's also during this period that he develops an interest in Buddhism that kind of becomes one of the main themes and drivers of the plot.
Well, we should also talk about the Uyghur princess, because that's Well, let's talk. Well, I just because I feel like the sequence is important, because like with the Uyghur princess, so there's like this daring raid that gets made, I believe, on one of the cities that the Xixia are in command, and he's kind of like a battle. I would say like he's got battle legs. He knows what's up. Wang Li is sort of his commander, and he recognizes in our protagonist that this guy can kind of do things, and like he kind of sees our protagonist as like fearless. But our protagonist, I think, kind of just doesn't like he doesn't really feel strongly one way or another. So anyway, they do the battle, and he's charged with lighting these signal flares. And when he does so, he comes across a Uyghur princess, and he takes care of the Uyghur princess. He prevents her from being harmed when the soldiers take over the city, because I think there's an implication that she might get raped. And so he hides her, and then eventually he's like, I want to get sent to this other city so that I can do the dictionary, like you said, John. And he has to leave the Uyghur princess behind, at which point she becomes apparently attached to his commander, Wang Li, who acts like he doesn't love her, but he does. And then he, at that point, after he's working on the dictionary, he decides that he maybe won't go back to see the princess. And it's a really interesting moment of character psychology where I know for me, since I'm like sort of time obsessed, I would have been headed back to see the princess as soon as my year was up. But like, it just says that like our protagonist is just like, yeah, and then some time went by and I was still working on the dictionary and I didn't really feel like I needed to head back. And then along those lines, that's when he starts getting interested in Buddhism, when he's like thinking about the consequences of his actions, basically, and kind of like, the fact that I can't remember. Does he get involved with Buddhism after he learns the fate of her, or is it before? Because I'm remembering it was before.
But it's the same chapter, so I can understand how you got it.
Okay, yeah.
Up.
So basically what happens is he comes back after not keeping his yearly appointment to the Uyghur princess, and
everyone thinks he's died. Crucially.
Yeah. So the Uyghur princess is actually a concubine of one of the Xixia commanders, and she sees him and she recognizes him, and then she runs away, and he's like, maybe I'll talk to her later. Then she commits suicide, and it's described in this sort of like really interesting way where the narrator tells us that he sees like a speck on the wall, and he sees the speck like fall off the wall, and he doesn't put two and two together that it's the princess until much later. At which point he then realizes that oh man, she committed suicide for me, and now she's dead, and what's going to become of her soul? At which point he gets involved with Buddhism. Then he decides, I'm going to complete this Chinese dictionary, and I'm going to dedicate it to her. So he's only doing it more or less for her soul. And sort of like the Buddhism, his interest in writing, his experience having, met and fallen in love with this Uyghur princess, they all kind of meld together. And it's a really interesting moment of like character psychology. And I think that sequence of events is important because I feel like it's very cause and effect what happens, I think, which I think is cool. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I think it makes sense in kind of the context of Buddhism. You know, Buddhism is a creed that's very concerned with karma, cause and effect. You know, he makes a choice that leads to other people making another choice, and it makes him feel a certain way, and that leads him to the Dharma. And I kind of, like you said, like I think that the way that this book really constructs this character of Sing is really, it's interesting because, like we keep saying, and I feel like we're being a little bit broken record here, but like the prose is very sparse. Like there's not a lot of description of like his internal feelings. Like it's not nothing. Like when he realizes the Uyghur princess has committed suicide out of shame, you know, it says like his soul writhed with repentance.
Yeah.
And it's after that he kind of finds himself drawn to religion. And it said like he didn't have a lot of time for religion before, but now he's developed this interest, and he's kind of brought around to seeing the value of Buddhism and wanting to learn about it.
I also like that it's described that he starts checking out a lot of religious texts. Because again, he's a reader. He's like us, John. He's like, I need to read more about this to know more. And so like there's like descriptions of sort of like the texts that he's checking out and reading as he's like, you know, really fervent for Buddhism to kind of like have the answers for him for what happened.
Yeah. And I don't know, I just really like the matter of factness of the prose, just the way that it's constructing this character in this way where like I felt like it's a very vivid portrait in a way, but it's not, like you said, kind of doing the Mishima thing where it's really like getting into his psychology in this very like in-depth sense where like we're in his head and seeing all the details. Like it's just kind of describing his actions and giving like a little bit of context. And I think it's really interesting how effective I think Inoue's like portrait of this character is, because he's the protagonist. Like we really do not spend a lot of time with any other characters. You know, we've referenced a couple other characters, but really for the most part we're really only ever with Xing Te, and everybody else is just kind of on the periphery.
Yeah, I do have a quick example that I think might demonstrate some of the prose, so we can give an example of it. I'm going to attempt not to butcher these pronunciations. So this is from when our protagonist is reunited with his commander. So on the road from Sichuan west to Yumen, the 1,000 mountains and all the plains are covered with white grass. This is in quotations. Xing Te recalled this line from an ancient poem he had read years before in his home country. Teaching it to Wang Li, he told him that if the poem was correct, the white grass they were riding through would continue all the way to Kuashu. Wang Li did not reply, but asked instead with obvious emotion why Sung Te had come to the frontier. He added that Sung Te should have returned to China from Xingqing. But since I'm here, there's nothing I can do about it, Sung Te said with a laugh. That's right, now you're here, there's nothing you can do. You came back with your mind made up to grow old and wither away in the white grass plains, Wang Li said. And I think that moment is great where like Wang Li is like, oh, you want to grow old, you want to die. Like, and Wang Li, of course, is like battle hardened and he's like okay with dying. And so like there's a lot under there that's happening. And, you know, Xing Te is kind of like matter of fact. He's like, well, there's nothing I can do. I'm already here. Like, and, you know, Wang Li is just sort of like, well, like, yeah, you know, you're going to die. Like, you know, so I don't know. It's like, and the fact that they're using a quotation to talk about it, I think, yeah, to me, that communicates his prose. So,
yeah. No, I feel like this is almost kind of a Bildungsroman in a weird way. Yeah. Obviously, again, it's taking this very like historical bent to it, and obviously we don't follow Xing Te like through his whole life. We start at like a very particular moment of it. But, like, I feel like it's really about his development in a way, and kind of the way that his development like both shapes and is shaped by kind of these historical forces that are, I think, Inoue is like really deep interest here and what he really is trying to explore. But I think he kind of can't help himself but to really beautifully sketch this guy kind of developing. I thought it was really interesting kind of for a Chinese novel. and Ben, you obviously have some experience with Chinese literature at this point. There's really no reference to like his family. Like he basically, like, despite being from a background where he's able to like study Confucian texts and all these things, there's no reference like he has to tell his family like, hey, I'm going to the Western frontier. No one seems to care that he leaves. Like, he never references like his parents or like what they're up to, which I found very odd because, you read a lot of like, I don't want to essentialize or anything, but especially medieval, period Chinese literature is very concerned with lineage, and particularly again for the kind of the scholarly class that are studying, Confucius, which is all about, parental relationships and governmental relationships. There's just, he just kind of is at the beginning. He's just kind of this free floating guy who can just kind of like go here and do his stuff without having any like kind of ties that are binding him or concerning him before he leaves, which I think is an interesting choice to make.
Yeah, and I wonder too if that's not unrelated to the opening where Inoue quotes that one emperor who says like, gold and women can be found in the classics, read the Analects, read Confucius. So it's like history just starts and ends with like this like textual basis, so that there's like, and I guess if he had a family, they would like, he'd get bogged down by having to tell his family that he's going to the frontier. And like, it's like wants that like close focus on the scholar and the forces of history. And I think that is in many ways a lot like Name of the Rose, because when you read the sort of other material on Name of the Rose, Iko was really interested in like other forces of history that were constraining this like locked room detective mystery. And like, if you read him talking about it, he's like, well, if I wanted a guy like Sherlock Holmes, it would have to be like a guy who worked with this monk. And if I wanted a guy that worked with Occam, then it would have to be this controversy. So like, he's like, and in that book, it's less on like how forces kind of constrain you. But like for Iko, it's still there. And I think on this one, like, it's a lot about like him kind of being like, buffeted through life by kind of what happens and making peace with what happens too, as well, as opposed to like resisting it or something.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I do quite like that quote. I'm just imagining like, you can find your riches in the Confucian texts. Like I don't know. That's really, it's an interesting historical detail. Like it's like, just imagine like the president saying like, you got to read your books, folks. That's how you succeed. Like, I just think I can't, I don't know. That's like, I don't know. That's really interesting to me, I guess. So.
Yeah. We want to read that passage?
Yeah, we should do it. Let's do it.
This is a passage written by the Emperor Chen Sung on the importance of education. No need to acquire rich lands to increase the family's wealth. Foreign books are 1,000 measures of millet. No need to build mansions in which to dwell in peace. Foreign books are abodes of gold. Complain not that you have no attendants when you leave your home. Foreign books are horses in numbers beyond reckoning. No need to lament the death of fair maidens when you marry. Foreign books are maidens with the countenances of jade. You who would realize your aspirations, use the light from your window and recite the 6 classics.
So that's like the promise that's given our protagonist is like that, like, and of course like he ends up doing other stuff, but like I think that is interesting for why there's not a whole lot of talk of his family, because it's like he's almost like a pure potential kind of like, like I'm going to get this like gold medallion that I'm kind of like thinking is here, and then as you said, like there's a giant reversal and
so really I think get the full picture of this text, we kind of have to talk a little bit more about like where it ends, because the end is really what this book is about. That's a little trite to say, because I guess all books are kind of about what they get to at the end, but this book in particular, because of, again, kind of the questions and of history it's asking and the themes it's working with. So the 1,000 Buddha caves, which exist to this day in the modern day Chinese province of Gansu, are these very, very important, kind of grounds for Chinese Buddhism. There were monasteries there, temples. In particular, there were these caves. So my understanding is that basically these were caves that were used by Buddhist monks or hermits for meditation, and then over time, they were used for different purposes throughout history as kind of armies and places moved through this area. This is also this is like along kind of the Silk Road too. So there's a lot of trade happening in this area, which is why there are all these people kind of fighting over this land, even though it's mostly desert. But there is a particular cave that was kind of walled up, and no one knew that there was anything there. And then in the early 1900s, a guy named Wang Yuan Liu discovered this cave. He was just kind of a guy who lived in the area, and he found all these ancient texts. And this incident is actually related in the last chapter of the book. He ends up kind of getting into contact with some Europeans who are traveling in the area who are very, very interested in this cache of documents he's found. And then he makes contact with some English people and then some French people. And then finally the Chinese government actually shows up, and some soldiers basically just take all the rest of the documents without paying him anything.
And he's like hiding. It's described in that.
Yeah, he's like kind of scared of the Chinese soldiers because I think I think the implication is probably that he probably shouldn't have been selling these things off to Europeans. But basically, there is this tremendous cache of ancient religious documents that are sealed up in this cave, including the oldest known intact book we have in like human history, which is a copy of the Diamond Sutra from the year 800 something. I feel like you said it earlier, Ben, but I don't
it's like 880, I think, is with the date. Like, Inoue makes a point of it in the intro, and then even has our protagonist make that book, which I think is cool. It feels very like closing the circle, kind of.
Yeah, but there's also a bunch of texts, even non-Buddhist texts. Like there's texts on Manichaeanism, which is a kind of dead religion that has its roots in Persia. There's Jewish texts, and basically just this tremendous just treasure trove of documents from all these different faiths end up kind of in this cave, and no one knows that they're there until this kind of random guy just stumbles onto them. And this is the event that Inoue is trying to like get us to at the end. He wants to explain why this happened, where these came from, and the whole story is kind of an invention of people who can get this event to happen. We don't actually know how this came to be entirely, at least as far as I know. I don't have all the. Maybe they've made some discoveries since then that has clarified what happened here. I don't know for sure, but at least insofar as this book is concerned, Inoue did not know exactly how this came to be, so he invented this story to explain that. And so I like what you said, Ben, about this kind of closing the circle here. So, what do you think kind of is the point here? So I know you, in our show notes here, you wanted to talk about specifically historical fiction and determinism. So I'm curious as to kind of what your thoughts are here.
This sounds like a bad dissertation title. So I think, when we read Name of the Rose, it's kind of an example of historical fiction, but it's kind of like a cool what if kind of like, what if we treated historical fiction like an active detective story? What if we restaged Sherlock Holmes in, medieval Italy, basically? And I think this one presents a really interesting phenomenon where whatever is going to happen has already, in a sense, happened. And so when you get the character introduction, he is having emotional revelations, he's having his life change, but the whole time where he's going to end up. And to me, it gave this feeling of like, I think there's this is the good version, but I think the bad version is when you watch a particularly bad prequel movie And there's this feeling like they're just, they're explaining where Darth Vader came from, like all the pieces are lining up. But in terms of this novel and its kind of concerns with like, forces of history, Buddhism, and like acceptance, that sort of aligned to me for like what the interests of historical fiction could be. But to me, it's almost like I'm presenting somebody who basically kind of, while he's driven to do things that, like we said, might seem unconventional, like if he had a family, he kind of leaves his family behind for the West. He's sort of like in line with the forces of history, and he makes peace with his actions and his behavior, and he basically allows history to continue. Because, if we're taking this to be true, without his actions, we don't get the book from 880. We don't get this cache of scrolls. So it's almost like you get historical fiction as like what would it feel like to kind of succumb to history, kind of like, but in a way that's not like defeatist or upsetting. And it's sort of like determinist. It's like, everything that you're going to do, you've already done. And so the point is to kind of make peace with what you're doing. And I found myself kind of floored by that at the end, because like I said, I think the kind of like prequel version is really dumb and annoying, because it's like we've just sutured over this like canon, like whatever pop culture superhero stuff. But like with this, it's like, yeah, like he went like as far out as he possibly could for the time. Like he went to the frontier, he like killed people, he like rescued somebody, he like translated stuff, like I don't know, and then he still has to kind of like make his mark basically and let history continue by saving these documents, which of course he's not like aware of. But I don't know. Like I feel like it's a portrayal of historical fiction I feel like I don't see a lot. Usually it's just like, hey, wasn't this period of time fun? Which this book is definitely doing, but in terms of just like allowing history to continue, I think it's pretty unique.
I think obviously, like, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here, but I feel that a lot of historical fiction, at least that I've come across, is doing one of two things. Either it is portraying a real historical figure and kind of like, I guess, like biofic, for lack of a better term. Like it's taking a famous person who maybe you have or haven't heard about in history, or maybe not famous, but a real historical figure, and attempting to use history, basically like using their viewpoint as like a way to look at history, look at a particular story, look at themes, from that person's perspective. Like I think The Fraud was kind of doing that, since like we talked about in that episode. Eliza was a real historical person that Zadie Smith kind of tried to put herself in the shoes of to tell that story. And, embellished here and there, but, at some level was working with like a real person. Or if it's not doing that, it's more just kind of dropping you into like a hypothetical person who exists in this time period, but their life and the event, like they're just kind of a witness to like the big events in history, and maybe bigger picture stuff is just happening outside of their influence, and we're just seeing kind of a small corner of it. I think this book is doing something interesting in that it's taking an event that, probably at the time seemed pretty small to the person who did it. Something important, but, at some level, when you live in a war-torn place like this, valuables getting hidden was kind of a regular fact of life. Getting lost for that long, I think, maybe was a little more unusual, but it was just kind of a thing that you had to do to keep valuable things from getting destroyed. But I think that taking this event that in the grand scope of history, I think is incredibly important and huge, and advanced our understanding of language and cultures and religions that are so far distant from us now, taking this event that did actually happen and saying like, okay, I don't know how this actually happened in our timeline, but I'm going to try to work backwards and tell a story that is going to explain how this event happened. I think it's a very different approach to historical fiction than I think we see a lot of the time.
You know what? When you put it that way, John, this is what it reminded me of. Rogue One. You remember Rogue One?
I never watched it.
Okay. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but Rogue One was literally like, how did they get the plans in episode 4, the first Star Wars movie? And it worked backward from that situation, and everyone ends up dying. So it's like the one downer Star Wars movie that got made with all of these like prequel nonsense. And I think that kind of like inevitability is really interesting. And I like this version a lot more. But like that's the specific feeling you get when you watch Rogue One, where it's like they clearly worked backward from this Star Wars plot point, and it was like, how do we get there?
Yeah.
And it ends up being like a more depressing story than you get in Star Wars usually. And in this one, I don't think it's depressing. I think like he kind of fulfills this function in this like really interesting way. That's, you know, and he does, you know, die, but like I don't know, like it feels more in line with the themes as opposed to just like a pop culture like, you know, movie that people watch, you know, something like that.
Well,
so,
you know, I think that there's something to this where, like you said, this is not like he is not like lauded as a hero in his lifetime. He's not you know, this is not like a traditional like heroic narrative. This is a story kind of about one guy who, yes, like in some ways lives like a very like cool, interesting, like adventurous life, but that's not really like his focus. He's not like doing this because he wants to be like a hero. Like he's doing this because he is genuinely moved by Buddhism and the teachings, and he feels like these things need to be protected and preserved, like both for kind of ideological reasons about his faith and partially like kind of out of this like sense of guilt that he has that, you know, he didn't save this woman that he had this relationship with. And so this kind of becomes, in sort of a more psychological sense, this kind of becomes a way of trying to undo the harm he caused in his, you know, irresponsibility. You know, he dedicate, you know, what the text he contributes that, you know, is not just something he's preserving, it's something he wrote. He writes a copy of the Heart Sutra, I believe in the Xixia language, and he dedicates it to the soul of the Uyghur princess, basically saying like, in doing this, I hope that like I can earn her soul like freedom from its bad karma, and that like the Buddha will have mercy on her. Like theologically, that's not the right way to put it, but I'm paraphrasing essentially. I think I feel like I'm coming back to the fraud episode a little bit. You know, I feel like something we've talked about before on the podcast is sort of where does an individual fit into history, which is a very broad question, and one that we're obviously never going to answer on our book podcast. But I feel like it's again, I feel like as we've done the show, like we keep kind of hitting on these themes that crop up again and again as we kind of work through texts that interest both of us, and you know, maybe that says something about literature, maybe it says something about the two of us, but I feel like I'm kind of thinking about the fraud, and I'm thinking a little bit about Bolaño, and I'm thinking about like what is like the individual's like role in history, and particularly like, again, if you're someone like Ching-te, someone maybe like us, you know, when you're living in times that seem chaotic and things are unstable, you know, I think obviously, again, we live in like America, like our lives aren't necessarily scary in like a day-to-day sense, but I think, you know, we can't argue that we're not living through like this time of like very weird global instability, and like the future does not feel stable in a way that I think even for like the characters in this book it does. Like even though the Xixia like kind of rise and fall over the course of this book, there's never exactly this idea that like, oh, the world's going to end. Like empires rise and fall, China endures. But
right, and crucially, a lot of this is happening on the frontier.
Yeah,
you know,
but I think
you
know, I agree with you. I think there is like a deterministic element to this book, but I think there's also this element where it's like it's asking like what is worth preserving? Like what are the things that we feel like are worth saving for the future? And kind of going back to our discussion earlier about like NYRB and like what they're doing, and I think again like what we're kind of trying to do in this podcast. Obviously, again, we live in a world where like we're not going to put stuff in caves. But it is really interesting. You know, we're living in kind of this weird like information apocalypse, for lack of a better term, where you know, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's amazing sometimes to think about like all the AI slop that's been generated like in the last year. And again, I don't have all the numbers in front of me, but something that we don't think about a lot is like we think because of the internet that everything we have, like all these books and movies and music, that it's all just floating in the ether and we can just pluck it out at our convenience. And, you know, obviously there are gatekeepers and boundaries in terms of like the people who like sell stuff to us, but we never have to worry about the stuff itself not being there. It's just about like, can we access it like through these institutions like streaming services or libraries, you know, that have different kind of rules for how you can access it.
I'm pro pirating, but and not that we should preserve this, but like the Vice, you know, .com website is getting just ethered, obviously
exactly.
that it's like like all of these writing is just gonna disappear without, you know,
disappear into the ether.
Out of the
like
cloud.
I'm sure a lot of that is still like saved in places like the Internet Archive, so I'm sure that there will still be like ways to find it. But A, it's not going to be easy. But two, like the thing people don't understand, and I think that it's very much intentional to some degree for a lot of these kind of institutions that control access to this stuff, the internet is like literally a physical thing. Like it is a series of cables and fucking physical servers.
The
like,
Internet of Things.
Stuff is stored somewhere. And theoretically, like there is a limit to like how much physical like memory we can fit on planet Earth. Like and especially now that we obviously like a lot of like the data like on the broader like internet has been garbage for a long time, but it seems like there's only more of it every year, especially now that again we have stuff like generative AI, which is literally just producing exponentially more garbage than was getting produced like again 2 years ago. And I think that like preservation isn't maybe exactly the word, but I think that there's something very valuable, like existentially, in terms of like kind of finding the things that you care about and you think are worth preserving. Because I think that the future is unstable, and I think that there is going to come a point where like there's going to be so much slop on the internet that people are going to have to almost like look to other places for information or for, you know, even something as simple as entertainment. You know, I maybe I'm a crank, maybe that's a stupid thing to think, but I don't know. I think that we all think the environment we live in is like very stable, and I think that like we're seeing that it's not quite as stable as we think it is. So I don't know. Am I rambling? Does any of this make sense?
No, that makes sense. And two, like, I think, you know, the cloud isn't stable either. So, like, if you like something, you should get a hold of it. Like, you know, you should keep it. You should put it somewhere. You should be able to touch it, because as we're seeing, like, it's not like, you know, what is it? Like, I always think about the sort of Western frontier of the, like, Mediafire Blogspot era, where you could just Google any album and immediately get like the files. And, you know, now they're streaming, they're gatekeeped, they're, you know, they're chart, like, et cetera, et cetera. So like, I don't know. I think like him making a choice to save these religious documents, like that's the choice the protagonist makes in the face of this temple getting burned. Cause that's sort of like the final situation is like, he could, you know, flee the city, but instead he's choosing to save these things behind this wall. And I think that's important. I think, like, as John said, it's worth doing, especially if, you know, we're being pushed towards not owning things, having everything in the cloud, and being paid for things that we already have. So, it's just, it makes sense.
Yeah, you know, it's one of those things. It's a comparison that feels on one level like very dramatic, but like the more you kind of look at the world we live in, and it's like, yeah, it's not like literally going to burn down, but it's getting harder and harder to find the things you want to find. just by Googling it, because Google doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, Google doesn't work anymore. Yeah, there's AI slop everywhere. I'm just trying to find the things that keep me going. Like as that quotation from the Emperor said, there's lots of stuff to be found in books and movies and whatnot. You just you need to keep the stuff safe.
Countenances of jade, abodes of gold. Listeners,
yeah,
that's what you're here for. That's what we're here for.
Well, and too, like, I have this. I wanted to read one other quote because I do like his prose a bit. And the one about determinism I think is interesting. So this is before he makes a decision to kind of save stuff in the town that is going to be razed by the army. He mused over what had brought him here, but he could think of no undue pressures on him nor any strong influence other than his own free choice. Just as water flows from higher to lower levels, he too had merely followed the natural course of events. Like that, like Inoue allows himself a rare simile there, and I think that kind of also blew me away too. Just like water flowing from the top to the bottom, like that's as poetic as it gets for him, basically. Like, and I think having it happen at this crucial moment, I think that's where I sort of see this kind of deterministic element to the history that's being presented here.
Well, that's so
which I find
interesting that you get determinism out of that, because it is also saying that like the only thing moving him is his own free choice. So there's also an element of kind of free will there, which I don't know. It's something I want to read more on, but I think Buddhism has a very interesting kind of different way of looking at like questions of free will and determinism than I think we get in the West, where these things are always like portrayed as these polar opposites. And I think Buddhism does something very interesting kind of terms of putting karma into the equation and kind of putting like lack of a stable self and the very different way like cognition is sort of thought of in Buddhism compared to like kind of classical Western thought is very interesting. And I don't feel like I am learned enough on that topic to expound on it much. But again, I think that what's really interesting about this book, again, is just why I really love reading literature and translation. Historical literature is just that the scope of human thought, human experience is like so much broader than like what we can conceive of, like kind of in the spheres we find ourselves in. And I love anything that kind of makes me realize that like the world's bigger than my day-to-day life. And I think that reading a book by a Japanese guy about a Chinese guy who's really into Uyghur guys is cool and can just open up a lot of different ways to think about the world.
And too, I think, as I was sort of saying in the beginning, I think like this book also has a great defense of being like a fan or an enthusiast of something, because like, again, like his interest in books and stuff kind of drives him, through his choices. And it even, culminates in him like saving these religious texts because it seemed like it was the right thing to do. Yeah, I don't know. I like defenses of
like,
that. Yeah.
One thing I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying about this being a Bildungsroman earlier. One thing I like about this book, and again, I think it's also kind of about the fact that, again, like we don't get him like dwelling on his choices a whole lot in terms of like, again, there's no bits where he's like, oh God, I should have stayed in China. I should have, never come here. I should have gone back and taken the exam next time it was offered. I kind of like this book as just kind of like a picture of like you said, amateur, like an amateur passion, but also just like going all in on something, for lack of a better term. I feel like I'm someone who struggles a lot with like making a choice and committing to it. I feel like if I have like a flaw as a person, it's that I dissemble too much, and like I'm constantly just like agonizing over choices to the point where like I always like think of it as just like I always agonize over choices until the world makes a choice for me, and then I just kind of continue to agonize about the new set of choices that gives me. And I really just liked this book. I really like reading about people who just decide that they're going to dedicate their life to like a thing, and they just do it, and they don't worry about it.
Yeah, he doesn't spend, like a day or two going, should I go to the border? He's just like, I'm going to the border. like I'm gonna learn about this language that I don't know about. So.
It's cool. It's a cool book. All right. Well, okay, listeners. So we're gonna, now that we're kind of reaching the end of our discussion, we're gonna try to bring back a segment that some of you might remember from a couple months ago. That's right. We're doing bad reads.
We're bringing bad reads back because I think for this one, there are some particularly good ones that I think, to me, sort of demonstrate why this book is interesting. So,
yeah. So if you like bad reads, if you want us to keep doing bad reads, sound off. But Ben, why don't you share a bad review of Tun-Huang by Yasushi?
So this is a short one. I found the central characters rather two-dimensional and nothing particularly interesting in the plot. Perhaps I am not Buddhist enough to appreciate the pointlessness or simplicity of it all.
That's one of those reviews where, like, sometimes you read a bad review and you have to wonder, like, why did you pick this up? Like, what do you like reading?
Why did you finish?
Like, well, I mean, this is only like 200 pages, so I kind of can't fault someone for finishing it if they didn't like it. I definitely have finished reading books I didn't like that were longer than this. But like the book kind of spells out what it's about. Like, again, at the very end, it's like it's about this getting to this point. Like, what was the alternative this guy would have wanted? But
also, like, pointlessness and is sort of insulting to Buddhism. Pointless and simplistic. It's apparently Buddhism would turn those into virtues. Like, it's sort of insulting, I feel like. So
yeah, I agree with that. I also, like, I don't know, I always find it so weird when people are like, this was pointless. It's like, you're reading a book. Like, of course it's pointless. Like, if you want to read something that only has like a point, like, just read textbooks, I guess. Like,
well, I don't know. Too, like, I feel like in order to write something, like, you have to have a point. You know what I mean? Like there's clearly like an author point to what happened, and then the ultimate point of everything. Yeah, but the ultimate point, it's like, why do it?
I'm gonna put on my Bloomian cap for a minute, and it's like, the point of reading is not to, like, reach some telos. Like, you're not like, right. No book has, like, you can get stuff out of books, you can get stuff out of reading. That's obviously we all do. That's why we're here. It's why we read. But on the other hand, it's like this whole idea that it's like a book needs to constantly be moving towards like a teleological point is, I think, just an incredibly annoying, like, way of thinking about literature. I don't get why people want every book to, like, I guess, just be, again, like an engine of nonstop plot to get to like a succinct thematic point. And I hate that way of thinking about books. I don't know why people want that.
Well, I almost feel like this book is an engine of nonstop plot.
That's like, with this book in particular, is like there's not a lot of fat here to trim. This is not Nightwood. Yeah. Like, this is not like a book that's all just like long digressions and poetic monologues. Like, this is about as this is almost like Hemingway prose.
Yeah, like, there's a lot of psychology beneath the surface. A lot of the, like, ostentation has been just trimmed off. Like, again, like a rare simile too, of the water simile, which struck out to be true. So
like, I wonder if with the simplicity, like, I do wonder, like, how much of that is like the translation, but
right
at the same time, it's like, man, I don't know. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it's one of those, like, write-off reviews, like the one that we did for Portis, where they clearly just, like,
you just don't get what's going on here. I do not respect you.
This one I think is particularly interesting, this next one, because it's a little more advanced. I usually like everything NYRB puts out, and if I find a random book in a thrift store with the label on the side, I'll pick it up. This was one of those finds. Anyways, the story starts out pretty interesting, with the guy leaving everything he's ever known to head off into the unknown. But about halfway through the book, his resignation towards his fate feels stagnant, which is crazy because somebody heading into a battle not caring whether they live or die sounds like a dramatic, interesting story. Much of the book reads like the historical introduction in the style of, and in this year, he traveled to the city of blank. The voyage lasted 5 days. When they arrived, he went to the governor, who ordered him to join the army of the city of blank. He joined a caravan and traveled there. The voyage lasted 7 days. It's as if the apathy of the protagonist towards his own life extends into the author's account. And it's not like I'm against books where the main characters are apathetic. It's just that this book reads like an accountant's travel journal.
I mean, like, I see the critique a little bit, but to me, like, the purpose of all that is it's about the scope. It's about illustrating the fact that this is a story that's taking place over like decades and thousands of miles. And I don't know, I think that there are different ways to handle that as a writer. I think you can do what this person seems to want, which is you can drill down into all the details and really build that out into an exhaustive plot where you really get into like what's happening every single day. Or you can do what I think this book chooses to do, which is use that, create space by being selective about what you talk about. I think that,
can you imagine if this book told us what he ate for lunch each day?
Like, I think that's a little. I don't think that's quite what this reviewer is asking for. But I think that, I think that there's always, this is a conversation that is always being had in kind of, again, readerly spaces. What's too much, what's too little, there's different schools of thought there. But I think that like this is a book that is using the choice, like this is not a book that is being sparse just because Yasushi Inoue attended the Iowa Writers Workshop and they told him to kill his darlings. Like, he's using the sparseness to communicate something thematic, and that theme is the theme of space, of the length of time, of the hugeness of history, and of this landscape that we're inhabiting. This is, again, like the Gobi Desert, basically. Like, this is that miles with no other living things around you. And I think that the decision to be very sparing with description and with detail is intentional. And
it's like one guy's life too. So like, again, as you said, it's not some dashing heroism. It's like just kind of a normal guy who happens to contribute to this important historical fact through a very small action. So I think keeping it spare fits that as well. So,
and again, I think that is also like the stuff with the apathy. Like we've definitely referenced Ching Te as being someone who has like a certain sense of like resignation to like the situations he finds himself in, but I rarely found him apathetic. I think that
because he cares about the Uyghur princess.
The Uyghur princess. He cares about like his soul, for lack of a better term. He cares about the companions he has over the course of his travels. I think that what the reviewer's reading as apathy here, to me, was like, again, this very grounded, like, humane perspective where most people don't think of themselves as heroic protagonists. They think of themselves as just people going through their lives and somewhat constrained by their circumstances and just kind of like doing as best they can. Like, I never read him as apathetic or like nihilistic, but it's just someone who like understands, like, I don't have a lot of options here, so I'm just doing what I can with what I have. But I can understand like how, to someone who's maybe expecting a more traditional heroic narrative, which I think this book kind of was sold as kind of an adventure story, and maybe that's kind of, and I think it is to some degree, but I think maybe that they came in expecting a more traditional kind of narrative where our protagonist can be moved by, self-propelled more.
Well, that actually segues nicely into the last bad review. The book's description speaks of magically vivid scenes, fierce passions, and astonishing adventures. A profound and stirring meditation on the mystery of history. The mystery of history is a nice ring to it. And the hidden presence of the past. I'm surprised by this description of a very boring book. Interesting concept, extremely boring implementation. The skeleton of the plot is somewhat interesting, but overall it's battle after battle with very little about the caves of Tun-Huang. So that's more or less what you said. Somebody was expecting what the blurb said. And I think you're right, John. I think it is, exciting, just not in, the way that we're, as you said, sort of like a propelled character getting into scrapes and stuff. Like, again, like I think I like this perspective that this has on the forces of history. Like they feel big and overwhelming and they buffet us around. And, we may think we're, bootstrap people, but, in reality, a lot of our decisions are already made for us, which I find myself, the more I talk about this, the more I come down on the determinist angle of this, which, like, again, I don't think is the whole point of the book, but I'm like struck kind of by like the water flowing. Like he just was doing what he did normally and everything is like lining into place basically. Like it's, I don't know. It's a good book.
The book is definitely
I like it, so
deterministic because again, it's I don't know. It's really interesting because again, it kind of gets into like how much can fiction actually like reflect reality? Because like a book is by nature deterministic. You have an author who's determining everything, and particularly in the case of this book, because again, it's starting with an event that actually happened. It's saying like, I'm going to reverse engineer a plot to get us to this point.
But I guess like with the fraud, like, we know that she dies. We know that these things happen, but it's so like ground level on her that like, you don't get this, like, you don't get her like accepting that she's going to be a nobody or something. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. There's like something about like that presentation, but yeah, I get what you mean. Like all books are deterministic. You can't change history by writing a book about, historical events that could have been different. But like having it's like almost like the character resigns himself to being an historical novel is almost what it like feels like. He's like I'm in something that's already been decided for me, and I'm going to do my best to come to terms with that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like I'm not saying you don't have a point on the deterministic thing. I just think that I don't know. I'm always interested in that friction between like we try to make like art as realistic as possible, and then there's still friction between like trying to make realistic art and the ways that it still does not quite like it in some ways constrains reality. I don't know, that might be too big a point to like get to like at the end here, but
well, I don't remember if it's Zizek or somebody else who says like the point where you're insisting that you're not being ideological is when you're in fact being the most ideological. So when you're saying like I'm presenting reality as it is, like that's like the most ideological you can be, as opposed to just kind of like having an idiosyncratic style that like might not be professing something.
We'll save that for the Zola episode.
yeah, we're gonna read the entire German Owl series. Well, I guess should we end by saying are we keeping this are we saving this from the fire?
Yeah. So let's look at the final thoughts. Ben, why don't you go first?
I think this book kind of won me over the more that I thought about it, which is something I haven't exactly had in a while, because when I read it, I was like, okay, I'm picking up on these themes. I'm enjoying the presentation. And then I finished it and I like had to really think about it. And the more I thought about it, the more it kind of like grew. I feel like, and I think there's a tendency to overwrite or to not overwrite, to just sort of say, oh, it was simplistic and it was sparse and it was, but I think like the more you think about it, it makes like certain narrative decisions, like to me, like grow more important, and, decisions that the author made to present things. And I think that's something, because I feel like in the books we've read, I've either been immediately won over or more or less came around by the end. But this one I actually spent a lot of time thinking about, like, for instance, why he changes his mind when he sees the woman who's about to be killed. So I think for that, I would definitely keep it. I also want to keep it as like some historical fiction that I feel like I don't see as much that we've talked about thus far. Because like if we count Bolaño and The Fraud and Eco, that's like, ground level historical fiction. And while this is ground level, this feels more removed. And I think that's like an important perspective. And so I think I would keep it for those reasons. I would save it from the fire. I would wall it up behind the temple
right.
wall.
Yeah.
So.
I very much am finding myself in agreement with you. I feel like I kind of chose this one. We were kind of discussing what book strike because I was like, okay, we're doing Nightwood, we're doing The Castle. Like these are both books that are just like so kind of twisty and turny, like that super dense prose, and I thought we needed like a little palate cleanser, just some nice simple adventure story to kind of get us into that fun springtime feeling. And then I'm always surprised when we do the show. There every so often I'm like, oh man, is there enough meat here for us to really like get into this and really like have an interesting conversation? And this was one where when I started, I was kind of like, oh man, like, is this it? Like, is this all we're gonna, are we gonna be able to fill like an hour and a half talking about this? And then by the end of it, I was like, oh yeah, we're gonna have more than enough to talk about here. And yeah, it's always impressive when you read a book that is like, feels like it's concise and it really knows what it wants to do, and it pulls it off. Like this is 200 pages even, and I feel like there is so much like interesting thematic content, and like I really do think the translation is beautiful in a lot of places, and I think that the choices that Inoue makes in terms of how he portrays his characters is really interesting, and it's so different than how so much like Western like writing does it, because we're also like obsessed with like neurotic psychology. That so it's really nice to like read a book that is taking like a very different tack, and just kind of like giving us people doing stuff, and you kind of have to infer the psychology a bit more. So yeah, I absolutely think this book is worth saving from a rampaging army of Tenguts. I would also seal it up in a cave to be found like 500 years later by some bumpkin.
He sells it to an ignorant
our descendants.
That's true.
A bumbling bookhead,
just a bumbling explorer guy,
looking for that jade countenance maiden.
I know we're at the end here, but I also like the epilogue feels like narrated slightly differently, which is cool. We don't have to get into it because we're at the end here, but I liked the kind of like, it felt like I was watching like a fast exposure of a movie after like what was sort of like a slow movie. Like the epilogue, like, time passes really quickly, and the guy's like, why did I sell that bumbling bookhead all of these like religious documents? But then like, Eno is like, but they saved, they were like furthered the cause of, Asian religious studies and history, by this finding. So sort of a net positive.
Ben, this was a wonderful conversation as always, but I don't know about you. I have to go sit by the light of my window and recite the 6 classics.
Yes, and I have to reflect on the fair maidens of jade that I will get fired for my
listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Next week,
until next time.
You got 2 weeks. Get reading. It's a big one.
Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you like our show, I hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice.
Sever books.
Helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.